Yeah, well, I'm so excited to be with you guys today, and I'm so honored that you thought of me to be part of your meeting.
Well, honestly, you came to town. We were so excited to have you here, and it's like we need to talk to you again. And it was very nice of you to offer to join us.
Of
Um,
course,
we
of course.
and of course, most of us have read your book, or in fact, our book club just reviewed it a few weeks ago. So we've been having all kinds of fun with what your work has been doing recently. We've also been following what you're doing with other articles and events. So I'm having interesting chases of things on Instagram and Blue Skies where I follow you as well. I do appreciate all the work you're doing and all the effort you put in and how great a positive attitude you have when you share these things. And honestly, I think you're a great writer and I appreciate all your time that you put into this.
Oh,
So,
thank you. Well, that's really nice to hear.
well, and it's we're at large and we have to forget that people everywhere need to hear these things, and we appreciate that you
Yeah,
share with us, right?
yeah.
So with that, feel free to it's your meeting, do anything you would like, talk about what you would like. There's not really scripted. I'm glad to have you here. I'm sure there's people with questions and things they would like to talk about with you, but as you wish.
Yeah, I thought I could start by doing a reading and then we could do a Q&A. Does that sound good to the group?
Mhm.
Perfect.
Okay, awesome.
Yeah.
Great. I actually need to grab, sorry, in my flustered with the web update. I need to grab my copy of my book, but I'll be right back. Okay, got it. All right. Well, I'm so excited to be talking to you guys today. As you guys probably know, the book covers the 2020 McGirt Supreme Court case that resulted in the largest restoration of tribal land in U.S. history. And so that case started as a small town murder in 1999. And then eventually went all the way to the Supreme Court, and this question of whether or not Muskogee Nation had a reservation was answered by the court, and then subsequently our reservation and Cherokee Nation was also upheld. And the book, in addition to talking about the court case and following it from the murder all the way to the Supreme Court, sort of goes back and forth in history. And in the history part, I dive pretty deep into the story of the Ridges and their decision to sign the Treaty of New Echota, which of course, like we all know as Cherokee people, was very controversial. And so I'm going to read an excerpt of the book that kind of picks up after the Supreme Court has decided Wooster v. Georgia, but then Andrew Jackson has refused to enforce that decision. And so it kind of picks up with John actually meeting with President Jackson in Washington, D.C. to discuss with him whether or not he's going to enforce Wooster v. Georgia. Okay, so here we go. From his education and years of diplomacy, John could see what was politically possible, arguably more than most of his fellow Cherokees. John began thinking about the previously unthinkable, signing away the land of their ancestors in exchange for land out west. It's a heartbreak many oppressed people have known, but one we don't like to talk about because it shatters our notions of progress. The heartbreak of giving up on justice because you know it's not possible. What had changed was not John's desire for Cherokee Nation to remain in their homelands. It was his hope. In their private meeting, even Andrew Jackson sensed the emotional reversal taking place inside the Cherokee leader. In a letter to an old war buddy, Jackson called it despair. Major Ridge, John Ridge, and Elias Boudinot would spend the next 3 years writing petitions, making speeches, holding public meetings, and advocating for their fellow citizens to support a removal treaty. They became known as the Treaty Party. Removal to them was the only option in which Cherokees as a people and as a nation would continue to exist. Did we act in such emergencies as these for our own private comfort? They wrote in one letter. We might choose to die here and bury our bones in the lands of our fathers, where white people might desecrate our tombs with the plowshare of the farmer. But when we think of our children, they pleaded, we will at all hazards seek freedom in the far regions of the West. Though unelected or appointed by the Cherokee people, on December 29, 1835, the Treaty Party met in the home of Elias Boudinot. By candlelight, the men signed their names to the Treaty of New Echota. Unable to read or write in English, Major Ridge signed his name with an X. He told the others, I have signed my death warrant. It is one thing to choose a death of honor. It is another to choose a death of disgrace. The Ridges forfeited their lives for the Cherokee cause, knowing they would not be remembered for their sacrifice, but for their treason. The treaty was illegal and undemocratic. The Cherokee people had voted down a removal treaty through public meetings and their elected representatives multiple times. By circumventing democracy, the treaty denied Cherokees the right to think for themselves. The Treaty Party's justification for their illegal act was the immense suffering of the Cherokee people. But shouldn't the Cherokee people, as they argued at the time, decide how to relieve their own suffering? And under the treaty, their suffering would get immeasurably worse. Historians still debate whether or not the United States committed genocide against Indigenous people. The crime has never been acknowledged by our government. At the time, the term did not exist. The word genocide, coined in 1944 during the Holocaust, combines the Greek prefix henos, which means race or tribe, and the Latin suffix cide, meaning killing. In 1948, the crime was defined by the United Nations as the intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnic, religious, or racial group by one or more acts of physical violence. The Cherokee word for our removal is Dgeja'i Lustana'i. It literally means when they drove us. It's the same word we use to talk about herding animals. To prepare, the Army split logs, drove them into the ground lengthwise, and built 25 open-air stockades. The majority of Cherokee people believed the treaty was being renegotiated, and if successful, they would stay. Earlier that spring, they had planted their fields of corn, looking towards the fall harvest. But on May 25, 1838, 7,000 U.S. soldiers and militiamen went out into the hills and valleys of Cherokee Nation to round them all up. Cherokees, startled by bayonets in their gardens or kitchen, were not allowed to collect any possessions for the journey or find their loved ones. At gunpoint, the militia drove a woman in labor from a remote valley town to the main concentration camp. Even after she gave birth, they would not let her rest. Finally, on a riverbank near the stockade, she lay down and died. The Army was woefully unprepared to feed and house their thousands of captives. The open-air stockades provided no shelter or sanitation. There was not even a place to go to the bathroom. At night, the militiamen roamed the camps, abducting and assaulting Cherokee women. By fall, Cherokees had buried 2,000 of their fellow citizens. As a newspaper reported at the time, that is 1/8 of the whole number in less than 4 months. When Cherokees marched west that winter, death followed. People walked over 1,000 miles. The footsteps of thousands left a trench in the earth. Although the exact number is unknown, one missionary estimated 4,000 people died between the camps and removal, a quarter of the total population. And the people blamed the Ridges. On the morning of June 22nd, 1839, John Ridge and his family awoke to a loud noise. A group of armed men kicked in their front door. They dragged John from his bed into the front yard. 2 men held John's arms while others held his body. They stabbed him 29 times. They threw John's body up into the air and stomped on his chest until it caved in. Then, as quickly as they had appeared, they left. John was still alive when his wife, Sarah, was finally able to reach him. He tried to speak to her, but all that came out of his mouth was blood. Sarah sent a runner to warn Major Ridge of the danger. The runner returned with the news Major Ridge was also dead. By my grandmother, I was raised to believe the assassinations were vengeful and wrong. As an adult, however, I do not agree. For what they did, I believe the Ridges had to die. According to the very law Major Ridge helped pass, the punishment for unlawfully ceding Cherokee land was death. And unlike the Republic of the United States at the time, our much older democracy followed the law. According to an even older law, our traditional blood law, for the souls of those who died on the Trail of Tears to travel on to the next world, their deaths had to be avenged. Otherwise, their blood would forever cry out for justice. From that view, the deaths of my family members allowed the souls of thousands to rest in peace. How could that not be justified? The Ridges are still considered traitors by a majority of Cherokees, a fate I think they accepted before they died. If what they had been trying to save was their own legacy, they would have never signed the treaty. What I believe they truly cared about, however, did come true. Cherokees as a people and a nation are still here. Cool. Thank you. Yeah, I could read a little bit more, but I thought I could stop there and see if there are any questions or any comments or anything that people want to share.
What's your interpretation of Governor Stitt's position?
Yeah, I mean, I think Stitt's like very anti-tribes, you know, and is just anti-sovereignty, and is pretty singularly focused on not working with tribes in a way that I don't think is what's best for the state. I don't know if it's some kind of personal animosity that grows out of his family's history. You know, his family's got on the Dawes rolls through fraud. And I think I don't know. I think he gets very angry when people point that out. So I don't know if it's some kind of personal animosity or if it's just, I mean, to me, it seems like it comes down to just like a power struggle. But yeah, I mean, he's just basically been as much of a roadblock to McGirt being implemented and being successful as he can be.
Hi.
Hi.
Hi. Well, first of all, I want to say that your narrative of the Treaty Party is, I think, the best. I mean, to the extent that there's still controversy, I think this is a narrative that offers the best resolution I've ever heard.
Thank you. That means a lot.
I think it's really powerful how you treat both sides and how you find resolution through Ridge's own words that he knew he was signing his death warrant, and kind of portraying it as an intentional act of sacrifice from his perspective. I think is really powerful, and I mean, you weave in all the nuance that should be woven in. I think that's great. And so I hope that this is, you know, the foundation of future narratives for generations, because I think it's just great. But one question I have, as you were rereading it, I was thinking, so they signed this treaty, but I mean, when they signed it, they knew they weren't the duly elected Cherokee leadership, and therefore any treaty they signed would be not really worth anything. And then the Cherokee leadership would have known that, obviously, and Andrew Jackson and the U.S. white government leaders would have known that as too. I mean, they knew all of these players, and so like everyone knew that this treaty really was not being signed by the right party. And yet somehow, I guess, everyone also knew it was enough to be approved by Congress. And eventually it was approved by Congress by one vote, I guess. But like, it just strikes me as weird that everyone is engaged in this game that they know is fraudulent.
Yeah. So to just like back up for a moment and give some context. So so the Ridges and their allies, the Treaty Party, have been like publicly advocating for a treaty for some years at the point that they signed. So like for 4 years, actually, at the point that they, well, 3 really, like 3.5, at the point that they signed the Treaty of New Echota. And so things had been like contentious with Ross for a while. But Ross kind of like extends a hand and is like, hey, let's get together and talk. So they have a private closed door meeting with Ross. And then what they do at Red Clay in October, which is like the big kind of like meeting of Cherokee government at the time, is that they form a delegate that has some Treaty Party members, but then is like mostly sort of like Ross and the formal government of Cherokee Nation, to go to Washington to sort of have a like final settlement of the difficulties facing Cherokee Nation. And so John Ridge actually is there and is part of that delegation and is in Washington when this Treaty of New Echota is signed by Elias Boudinot and Major Ridge back in New Echota, Georgia. And so there's this big back and forth between Ross and the Jackson administration of basically whether or not the delegation being sent to Washington will be welcomed in Washington, because the Jackson administration, and really it's this guy Schermerhorn, which Cherokee's nicknamed Devil Horn, who ends up like he wants any treaty to be negotiated through him within Cherokee Nation. And so Ross is kind of just like, screw that, we're gonna go. But they come together in this moment with this delegation. But then it falls apart really quickly. So this thing happens where Howard Payne, who's like this kind of weird like British guy, is like who becomes a close ally of Ross, publishes this op-ed about how Cherokee should become U.S. citizens, which the Ridges are very like opposed to, like basically like Cherokee Nation being dissolved and us being like absorbed into the United States, but staying on our land theoretically. And so then Elias quits the delegation. John Ridge threatens to quit the delegation. So there's still this effort for like the two sides to come to a solution together, but it's like quickly falling apart. And I think, it's hard to say, like Ross will then later accuse John Ridge of knowing that the Treaty of New Echota is going to happen, and that basically like them like plotting to like send him to DC and do this thing behind his back. I think there's also another interpretation that they were hoping that they could force Ross's hand. So there's this letter that Major Ridge writes to John Ross that is like kind of goes with the like treaty materials that go to Washington, because it's also kind of crazy to think about. I mean, it's like kind of obvious because like of the way that history works, but I feel like we don't think about it as like there are these like weeks, right? So there's like the treaty has been signed, people within Cherokee Nation know what has happened and are upset about it, but it takes like weeks for that information to like get to DC and for like Ross and these other leaders of Cherokee Nation to actually like know what's happening. And so there's this lag and there's this confusion, but there's this letter that's in one of the congressional documents, I can't remember which one, but Major Ridge sends to Ross that's basically like, look, we signed this treaty. If you have negotiated a better deal with Andrew Jackson while you have been in DC, cool, awesome, we support it, we'll get behind you. If you have not, we ask that you support this. And so I think that was kind of their position, was that, but of course it doesn't happen. And then like once Major Ridge and Elias Boudinot and like the people who signed the Treaty of New Echota get to DC, John Ridge and Stan Wadey like just leave the hotel where they're staying with the Ross delegation. I think without saying much, they sign their names to the Treaty of New Echota. And then the Ridges, along with the Jackson administration, start lobbying the Senate to ratify their treaty. And so they fight really hard, and I think are effective diplomats, and of course have like the benefit of the Jackson administration on their side and are able to put it through. And their justification is like, they basically accuse Ross of like deceiving the Cherokee people. And and they will use things, because then there's like a bunch of like public letters, like Ross writes these like public letters, and then Elias like publishes these things that become pamphlets and then like congressional documents. So they're like writing back and forth about like why each side is justified in the wake of the treaty being signed. And the treaty party's justification is like, they feel that like Ross has been lying to the Cherokee people, and that the Cherokee people like don't know the truth, like basically don't know that it's not possible to stay. And like they think that Ross has been deceiving the Cherokee people, and that's their justification. So Elias writes this thing that's like, that I can't remember the wording now, but it's basically just like, if the whole is being deceived and they're being lied to and they don't know the truth of their circumstances, then it's kind of beholden on the people who do know the truth to like act on it. Yeah, so I think that's how that happens. I mean, and I think the Jackson administration and Schermerhorn and sort of all, the Secretary of War and like all of these people who are very like involved in getting the treaty orchestrated are very invested in just like getting Cherokees out of there. And so they're happy, like they're totally happy to say that this is
they're looking for any viable
yeah.
No, that I totally get. And it sounds like, because as you describe it, this was all so public in Washington, D.C., the voting members of Congress must have been cognizant of, at least the ones that paid attention, must have been cognizant that there was this, in a sense, a vanguard party and the official party, and that they were at odds. But of course, Jackson then throwing his weight behind the one side. Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you. I've always wondered how this could have gone down when it was, when you had the official Cherokee leadership present and represented, by the chief and making themselves quite well known, how this got through. I mean, it got through because they wanted it to go through.
Yeah, I think that's a big part of the story.
So I have one other comment. There are so many great things in the book, and I love the history thing. And I'm begging my kids to read this book. They're all in their 20s and 30s, and the one part I had never heard before, although it's pretty obvious when you think about the times and the places, is the connection between the cotton plantations, the slave plantations of the Black Belt, and the Indian Removal Act. And granted, the Black Belt is less on Cherokee land; it's more, I guess, Creek and Choctaw land. But the tight connection, and the fact that those Black Belt slave plantations really only lasted 30 years between the Indian Removal Act and the Civil War. I mean, I was always thinking they lasted hundreds of years, but that's just not the case. Anyway, so you tell that story largely based on the work of one professor, and that's the first time I've ever seen that presented to a lay audience, and I thought that was great. Have you seen it presented elsewhere to like a common audience, like outside of academia?
That's a good question. I mean, I think the story that I have seen that I think is more common is the planters' need for new land, because cotton is really hard on land. And so and also just sort of the kind of crash crop, because tobacco did some of the same stuff too when tobacco was the main cash crop. And so I've seen people talk about that, about how planters needed new lands and how, and I think that's involved in a lot of the scholarship of people talking about like the Second Middle Passage and how the institution of slavery shifted geographically and how we get kind of like the deeper antebellum South. But yeah, I mean, I think Claudio Sant's work is like where he talks about like the House of Representatives and how, and his book is called Unworthy Republic. That's the only place where I've seen some of that information, like particularly where he talks about like the South's support for the Indian Removal Act and how much representation they had because of the 3/5 clause and how like the bill wouldn't have passed without that. Like I've only seen
they had 21
that
extra
from
votes.
Claudio Sant. He's a professor at University of Georgia. Yeah, so I think it's something that when I have read histories of like slavery, I have seen the Indian Removal Act come up in passing, but I haven't seen those things like tied together very clearly in a lot of places, which I think is a really important part of the story.
Yeah, I'm really glad you included that.
Thank you.
John Ross knew that they were going to be killed.
Like knew that the Trail of Tears and the roundup would happen.
No, that the
assassination
was going to sign. Yeah, the official word is he didn't know, and he was protected from knowing. But what do you per se believe?
It's interesting. I'm trying to remember what congressional document it's called. I can't remember the name of it. They're always like HR doc, da, da, da. But because that becomes a really big topic between Cherokee Nation and the federal government, because the federal government is trying to use the violence and the assassinations as an excuse to like not pay some of the money that's owed based on the treaty, and also to kind of like continue to say that like the Ross government is illegitimate. So he writes about it, and then a fraction of people who are kind of like the treaty party still, and then also some of the Western Cherokee who do not consider the union, the like active union we all celebrate to actually be a union. They feel railroaded by it. They're writing to Congress and saying, like, look how violent this government is. It's illegitimate. Ross absolutely knew. I mean, I think, and now I can't remember who it is, but it's either his, like, I think it's his brother. There are people who are very close to Ross who are part of, like, the room of people that decide to commit the assassinations. And then obviously there are people that, like, guard Ross's house, which I think is, like, an important part of the story. Yeah, so I don't know. I mean, I think it's one of those things that's kind of unknowable. When I read people writing about it, it was like, I don't know. To me, one of the things that was like the most interesting in the primary sources was seeing like these stories that I feel like Cherokee still tell, like seeing their origins. Like I'm like, oh, these are like the stories that people were telling like at the time. And so, but I didn't see anyone accusing Ross of knowing who would have known that firsthand. And so I feel like as a journalist and as a reporter, I can't say that he knew. And so that's why I didn't make that claim in the book too. But he's very much accused of doing it. But then those accusations are again like, because the tribe is so fractured, there's like this side that says he knew, and then this other side that says he didn't. Yeah. And but maybe there's something else in the historical record, but that's all I saw was sort of the accusations flying around. So, I mean, there are definitely people who are very close to him. I mean, I think that like the thing that Ross did that is true is that pretty much immediately after the assassinations happened, so like a month after, he and his government extended amnesty to everybody who committed it. And so I think that's the thing that's on the record that we know happened, that basically was like, okay, all these people who committed these assassinations, like we're not gonna punish you for doing it.
Yeah. Well, it seemed like the Treaty Party adherents, descendants, still blame Ross for it.
Yes. Yeah. I was raised by my grandmother that Ross like ordered the killings, was like the story I grew up with. Yeah. And you can see that. I mean, it's interesting, but you can see that in the letters at the time. That's what they, like Stan Wadey and people like that. That's what they believe.
What about the, going to a later time, the oil companies, their treatment, their drafting of the land?
Yeah, I think that that's a really big topic that I feel like we actually haven't talked about enough as a tribe. And I think there is a place in our story as Cherokee people that the Trail of Tears takes up for like the loss and the violence that it was, that is very important. And I feel like we haven't quite done that with allotment yet, if that makes sense. Like I think we haven't like told the story of allotment collectively and talked about the impact that it had on our tribe, which I think is equal, if not greater than the Trail of Tears, when you think about how much we lost at that time. But I think because the violence was more insidious, I think it's like harder for us to talk about. And it was also kind of dispersed. So because then the land through allotment was like held by individual citizens, and then the violence of separating that person from that land like happened to each person. And there's like, these thousands of stories versus sort of like this one story. I think it's a harder story to tell. But yeah, I mean, so for folks who don't know, like, obviously, allotment happened in the lead up to Oklahoma statehood. And unlike Osage nations, if people are like familiar with Pillars of the Flower Moon, where like there was a mineral estate and people had head rights, the way mineral rights worked in Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Creek, and Seminole nations was that the minerals were held by the individual allottee. So if you were allotted land and oil was discovered on your land, you could become very rich very quickly. And then there was a tremendous amount of violence that was perpetrated against those people. So I talk in the book really specifically about the story of Melina Harkey. So she inherited oil-rich lands in the Muskogee community of Red Fork. And before her 18th birthday, and this was actually like common, like it's documented in federal reports that it was a thing that happened. She was kidnapped and held basically out of state hostage to try and compel her to sign away her lands. And so people who were desperate to get leases or to own oil-rich lands would kidnap people, would use assault, would use fraud and deception. I read this one report of, I think it was around Bartlesville, but there was some oil development happening. And I mean, just to show just like how diabolical it was at a time when, and this didn't make it into the book, it was at a time when land was still restricted. And so you couldn't actually just sell your land if you owned your allotted land. It was still what's called restricted. But Congress could lift restrictions on individual allottees. And so they took 16 Cherokees that had oil-rich allotments and lifted the restrictions on them by name, by an act of Congress, without those allottees like knowing what was going on. And one of the stories of what happened to one of those guys, these businessmen sort of like took him on a trip to like Fort Smith. It was like somewhere in Arkansas, but it was like somewhere, far from where he lived, and he didn't have a lot of money. And then basically we're like, for you to get home, like we're either going to leave you here and abandon you here with nothing and no way to go home, or if you want us to like help you and get you home, you have to like sell your land to us. And so stuff like that and that's just like, there are like thousands of stories like that. And so I think the amount of like graft and theft and swindle and fraud is something that we haven't yet like collectively processed and talked about. So yeah, I actually am hoping to do a project working on that.
Good.
So my my grandparents got allotments, and immediately, because I actually have the original documents laminated here in this room, they immediately so they were unrestricted, and they immediately flipped them. They immediately, like the next year, I don't even know if it's about a calendar year, they sold, not all of them, but it looks like most of the portions of their allotments within 1 year. And this was 1907. They got the allotment in 1907. They sold them in 1908. This was outside of Grove, Oklahoma, just between Grove and the state line to the east. Yeah. And I imagine if they flipped them so quick, I imagine a lot of people did.
Yeah. So when restrictions were lifted, and now I can't remember the exact year, I think it was like 1907 or 1908. It was like right after Oklahoma statehood, and when like basically Oklahoma had representatives in Congress. So restrictions were lifted on anyone less than half blood quantum. And then I saw a federal report, I think I pulled this statistic from a federal report, that the majority of land was lost within 10 years. So yeah, it was lost pretty quickly. And I think too, it's like you have to think about like what it was like for those people. Like say, like imagine where you're living now and how you're living. Like you and your spouse, maybe you have like children. So like you're a family of like 5, right? And you're living in a community where you like, you know, like I live close to my neighbors. And you would have each gotten, like in Cherokee's, it varied, but you would have each gotten like over 100 acres of land. So now you're a family of 5 and you own 500 of acres of land. Like, what the hell are you going to do with 500 acres of land? You know? And so, and it wasn't like the land was set up where it's like, okay, you already live on this 500 acre farm and we're giving you like the 500 acre farm that you live on. It's like people would get land all over the place. You know, and so people got land that they had never even laid eyes on. And so I think that the system of how land was assigned and where people got land was also just sort of like unmanageable for a lot of families. And so
it was pretty clear. I mean, I know they were very poor. I've seen, so the house still stands to this day. It was built in the 1800s. It's one of the few old farmhouses outside of Grove that's still there. And I actually went in it a few years ago when I visited the current owners. But I've seen pictures of them, and my dad was one of 6 kids. And it was clear that they got, well, my dad, this was before my dad was born, but it was clear that they had hundreds of acres and they didn't need all those hundreds of acres. And they kept a parcel with their house, and they sold the outlying stuff because, you know, I'm sure they could use the money.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, I mean, it's sort of just, it's kind of like a mind-boggling system when you think about it, like, you know, and then in like Choctaw and Creek, you know, like in some of the tribes, like people got like hundreds of acres per person. And so, you know, Millie's family, once allotment was all said and done, they owned like basically like a square mile, you know. It's like, and so it's just like, you know, what are you even going to do with that land? And so, yeah. And then of course there was all of this like swindle and theft and like, you know, people not knowing what their land was worth, not even having had the experience of owning land since land was held communally. And so, yeah, there was a lot of taking advantage of people. But yeah. Any other questions about the book or any of these topics?
I really appreciated you weaving history in with the current events.
Thank you. Yeah, yeah. For me, it was an important part of telling the story of why the present day case matters, you know, is because of all of this history.
To what so I really appreciated your investigative journalism, like especially in the second season of This Land,
Oh, thank you.
where you look into the law firms and money that's behind like big oil,
Yeah.
the big oil connections to native child adoption, which seems like a Venn diagram that doesn't overlap, but it sure does. And that was great. So so I have two questions. One, who did you work with on the history side of the chair? Like you're intimately familiar now with all of these documents and stuff. Was that all just self-research, or did you work with some Cherokee historians?
Yeah, so I worked with a historian named James Anthony Owen, who is a teacher at the University of Georgia. He is not Cherokee himself, but his scholarship is focused on Cherokee Nation. He's actually from like Western North Carolina. Um, yeah, so he's a history professor, and he helped me gather primary source documents. So what I did with James' help was I started by reading books, but reading them for the citations and seeing like, okay, what are the primary source documents that, you know, Thurman Wilkins is relying on, or what is Taya Miles citing, or Theta Purdue, and like looking at their books and looking at their citations. And then I talked to some historians like Julie Reed and Jack Baker and Claudio Sa and folks, and said, okay, like what are the sources that I should look at? And then based on that, James and I created a huge and kind of unwieldy list of like all the primary source documents that we wanted. And then he did the incredible task of tracking most of them down. So some of them were, you know, easy to get because it's like the Moravian records are in a published volume, or like a lot of, not all, but a lot of the Ross papers are in, what's that collection by Milton? I can't remember the name of it, but it's edited by Milton. And so, but then some stuff is like the ABCFM papers, which is the American Board of, oh, it's like a weird American Board of Foreign Missionaries something. But anyways, like their letters, so like some of the really important letters from like Worcester, or like some of the records about like what kind of pupil John was, are at the Harvard Houghton Library. A lot of stuff is on microfilm, and so that was on microfilm at University of Georgia. So a lot of universities have these, like especially research institutions have these like microfilm collections. But you know, different things with different stuff. Like when I was researching Millinoharchy, we started with like newspapers. So just like honestly, like a newspapers.com search of like historical newspapers. And then from that got more information. And then I actually got a lot of the stuff through court records through Tulsa County. And so I like went to the Tulsa County Courthouse, like went through these like ledgers that they have, these ledger books, and got like case names and sent those to the records keepers in their microfilm department and at their like warehouse, and then pulled those things. We also pulled her BIA file through the National Archives, and pulled her probation file, which is like was like normally probate is for like inheritance, but because she had been declared incompetent and had a legal guardian, she had a really big probate file for all like her whole life. She had a guardian basically. Yeah, so it really kind of just depended on the time period. But you know, I sort of approached it by reading secondary sources, looking at the primary sources that they were citing, and then trying to go get my hands on those primary sources, and then also talking to historians and saying, okay, you know, here's my list of primary sources, like what am I missing or what would you suggest? So yeah, so that was the process. And then James, because I mean, it does just really, like, he is an expert where he's just like already knows where a lot of those sources are, or like things like the Phoenix, where it's like the Phoenix is all over, but it's like incomplete, if that makes sense. Like it's not in one place. And so sometimes like tracking down those articles was complicated. So
The Cherokee Phoenix is not all available in one spot.
So what Western Carolina University did this thing where it like typed out the articles, and so that's complete, but the way it is it's hard. I find it like not helpful because it's in without seeing it on the page, it's hard to understand what's happening because the way things are broken up on the page is like it's not continuous. I don't know if that makes any sense. So yeah, so we had to kind of pull the like digital archives. I think that the present day Cherokee Phoenix is working on having like a full archive that's complete, but I don't, at least when I was researching the book, it wasn't up, and that's not what we use. But that, you know,
Wow.
that might have changed. But that's a thing that like is true for Cherokee records in general, is like because of like the violence that our tribe went through, stuff is scattered and a lot of it is not held by our tribe. And so, you know, stuff is at Harvard, stuff is at the Gilcrease, stuff is like, you know, the Penelope something papers are like in Tennessee. Like, and so there's sort of just like, it's there's a lot, like that we have like a lot of documentation, especially once you get past like the 1820s, there's just like a ton, but it is like pretty scattered. So, but you know, we have an archive here at Cherokee Nation, and then the Museum of the Cherokee People and Eastern Band, I think that there are some efforts to, one, like digitize stuff and then have like a central, like a more centralized place for it.
So what's next for you?
Oh, that's a good question. Right now I'm working on an essay series with some other Indigenous scholars about how the U.S. treatment of Indigenous people and Indigenous resistance has fundamentally shaped U.S. democracy in ways that aren't recognized. And so we're trying to publish that in 2026 to coincide with the 250-year anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence.
So this is with Nick Estes, right?
Yeah. Cool.
Cool.
Yes, you know Nick. Yeah, so it's with Nick Estes, Maggie Blackhawk, Ned Blackhawk, and Phil Deloria. So it's kind of like a powerhouse of Native historians and legal scholars that I'm a little part of. And yeah, so that's the next big project. So hopefully that'll be out, in like a year and a half.
No season 3 of This Land?
We'll see. To TBD.
Maybe
that project might be a podcast series. So
maybe the material for that is happening in the next few weeks.
Yeah, dear God.
So did you have another section you'd like to bring up from the book?
Sure.
I mean, we're going to drill you. We'll make up questions, but I know you have.
Yeah. Yeah, I can read an excerpt. So this excerpt is from wait, what just happened? Oh, are you guys still there?
Mhm.
We are.
Okay.
Yeah.
I lost you for a second. I guess my internet went out. Okay. This excerpt is from the section of the book where the decision comes down. So this is about the McGirt decision. July 9th, 2020 was the last day of the Supreme Court's term. They had 3 opinions left to announce, 2 about whether or not Donald Trump would reveal his taxes, and then McGirt. Like everyone else that morning, I started hitting refresh. So many people were on the Supreme Court's website, it would not load. I sat waiting through agonizing minutes until finally I saw the link pop up. I clicked on it. The first thing I wanted to know was who wrote the opinion. In my mind, just that name would indicate whether we had won or lost and by how much. I scrolled past the syllabus to the bottom of the 4th page. In small capital letters, the PDF read Gorsuch. I started screaming, and then I wept. On the far end of the Trail of Tears was a promise, the opinion began. Forced to leave their ancestral lands in Georgia and Alabama, the Creek Nation received assurances their new lands in the West would be theirs for forever. Today, we are asked whether the land these treaties promise remains an Indian reservation for the purposes of federal criminal law. Because Congress has not said otherwise, we hold the government to its word. The first month of summer in Oklahoma was hot and dry. For weeks, rain was nowhere in sight. The lush weeds, wildflowers, and grass turned brown and crisp at their edges. Even the trees looked tired. That morning, the sky cracked open and it poured, a hard, pelting rain that pooled in the dirt. It was as if the earth knew. You can deny a people what is rightfully theirs for only so long. Eventually, something must give. That day, across eastern Oklahoma, tribal citizens celebrated the decision with joy and abundance. But it was a joy that also cut hard and deep. Our blood and our bones knew how much had been lost to reach this one act of justice. Chief Justice Roberts thought it was improbable that, unbeknownst to anyone for the past century, a huge swath of Oklahoma is actually a Creek Indian reservation. But for Cheyenne and Muskogee leader, advocate, writer, and elder Suzanne Harjo, in that century lies a lesson. Tribes have to keep asserting their sovereignty. There has to be Native people who keep saying, this is who we are, this is what we do, this is what we have responsibility for, these are the rights that we have, she says. No matter what kind of trickery they spend to try and convince us otherwise. For Harjo, the McGirt decision is why Native people cannot be deterred by the losses we face, even when it's a century of loss. Because we're on a longer timeline anyways, says Harjo. We're just not on the same timeline as other peoples are in this country. We are on a much longer one, backwards and forwards. And a lot of things are going to be straightened out along the way because they are too blatant to stand. The history of tribal land in the United States has moved, for the most part, unforgivingly in one direction. Prior to July 9th, 2020, American Indian reservations made up only 2% of all land in the United States, or about 56 million acres. For perspective, nearly 200 million acres are reserved for national forests. In the expansion of this great nation, our government set aside more land for trees than for Indigenous people. The McGirt decision resulted in the largest restoration of tribal land in U.S. history. Taken together, the 5 tribes' reservations cover 19 million acres, about half the land in Oklahoma and half the city of Tulsa. It is an area larger than West Virginia and 9 other U.S. states. The historic status of McGirt is ironic when you understand what happened legally. The Supreme Court didn't overturn anything, strike anything down, or change their own precedent. All the court did was follow the law, but still, that was radical. When it comes to tribal sovereignty, the U.S. government is spineless. Most often, when states or non-Native people want something that belongs to a tribe, whether it's gold, land, oil, or power, they get it, even when the law clearly protects the tribe. Greed, not justice, has governed more of our history than we care to admit. The lesson of McGirt is not that when the law is on our side and we fight really hard, justice prevails. The lesson is that although justice for Indigenous nations is rare, in our democracy it is possible. There is an easy mistake to make in telling the story of this case, which is to say that the reservation was given back to the tribe. This would be incorrect. Despite Oklahoma's position in the case, despite everything that was taken from our tribes, our reservations were never abolished. And you can't give back what already belongs to someone. In one of the darkest chapters of American history, this land was promised to us for as long as the grass grows or the water runs. In eastern Oklahoma, the grass is still growing, the water is still running, our fires still burn, and we are still here. And despite the grave injustice of history, our legal right to our land has never ended. Thank you.
Yeah, applause doesn't work very well, Alice, but thanks so much.
Yeah.
Yeah, we all have noise canceling microphones, so you never hear the clapping. Greatly appreciate your time. And I'd love to know, I love that you're working to extend this work. I mean, I know that your work on the oil industry and how it's affected Indian Act is another process step, right? So it's building on what you've already had here, and I'm glad to hear that that's continuing.
Yeah. Well, thank you guys so much for having me and for your support of the book and the podcast. I really appreciate it.
How do you think the Trump era will treat Indians?
Yeah, so far not so good. Yeah, I think the slashing of the federal government is already having a really disastrous impact. This past week, Haskell laid off a third of their staff, and IHS lost a lot of employees with the Trump laying off probationary federal employees. And so I think what's really delicate is the trust responsibility that the federal government has towards Indigenous nations and whether or not, that's going to be fulfilled.
So the probationary layoffs included the Indian Health Service.
Yeah. Yeah, I think ICT News was reporting it was like I think they cut it back, but originally it was going to affect over 2,000 employees, and now it looks like it's going to affect a little under 1,000.
And what news outlets do you follow to keep up with current events and other things around Indian country?
Yeah, I listen to Native News, the National Native News, which is a newscast that's part of Native America Calling. I follow ICT News. I think Indian Collective is great, and then Native News Online are some resources. And then there's Indians with the Z.com. Yeah. Well, like I said, I really appreciate you guys having me for your group. You'll have to let me know when you're in Tahlequah next, but this has been really great to talk to you guys more about the book, and it's always like such a joy to be able to like discuss it with fellow Cherokees and then within a community that like has more of like an intimate knowledge of these stories.
Well, next time you're up this way, give us more than a couple of days notice. We'll get something together.
Yeah, that would be great.
And I know I'll be there for holiday this year, so love you for that. So we'll find a way to cross paths soon.
Yeah, that would be excellent. I would really like that.
Any other questions or comments?
It's great.
Thank you very much for your time.
Yeah, thank you guys so much for, like I said, all the support of my work. I really appreciate it.
Well, and thank you for raising the banner so high. You're doing more.
I try.